We've got some breaking news as well just coming through to us here. Donald Trump, before the state dinner took place, we heard from Mark Esper, the US Defence Secretary. There has been a further approved deployment to Saudi Arabia to increase security in the region. Now, this announcement comes after last Saturday's attack on two Saudi Arabian oil fields. Look, it must be pointed out that this is defensive in nature in a bid to protect that critical infrastructure. I want to bring in now Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council, John Watts. John, good to see you. Thanks for your time. Timely that we're speaking to you now. This news just coming through to us here. What do you make of the timing and how significant is it?
It's significant for the relationship between the Saudi Arabia and the US. It's probably a confidence booster to Saudi Arabia to see the US support them with additional troops. The details of how many troops, what types of troops, how they'd be employed is really the element to the story that we'd need to draw out further.
The immediate sense of escalation about this is that by putting American troops in there, you're putting lives in there, which means if there is another attempt from Iran to do what the intelligence authorities in this country believe they did, and that was strike on those oil fields, then again, that's miscalibrated. It could end up hitting somebody and the chain of events become obvious. Is the inevitable effect, though, of the particular forces that are being sent in here that it's putting lives in theoretical danger rather than realistic danger, but also how do you think Iran reacts to this particular moment?
I think Iran would see this as a strong move by the US and would be a clear escalation to some degree, but a very minor one. It's not one that's going to provoke further aggression, I don't think. Again, it depends on the nature. If they're radar specialists, if they are, there to maintain crews, if they're on kind of an exercise as opposed to deployment, that's very different. But you're right, the presence of US troops in any area of tension, increase of any amount is going to send a message, send a signal, and Iran will be watching that closely.
Let's talk about the connections between Australia and the United States militarily.
Sure.
Is there a particular battle, particular act of bravery that you think best symbolises not just serving with, but truly serving for each other?
If I can answer your question in a roundabout way, I don't really think of a single act or battle. I think you could literally pick from dozens, if not hundreds, across the last 100 years. What I get, or the sense I get from working very closely with US Department of Defense officials and military officers over here is there's nowhere I go from the lowest ranked soldier at a National Guard unit through to, the Secretary of the Army or higher ranking official who doesn't want to tell me a personal story about how important they see the relationship. Everyone has some level of personal story of affection that they have with Australian troops. There's an old saying that the US doesn't have allies, it has interests. I have, in my time here, always questioned, is that just a bumper sticker, or is there something to that? The more I dig, the more I find that there is some genuine affinity between the American people and particularly between American soldiers and Australian service people.
We saw interesting language used by Donald Trump today, but it was kind of vintage Trump and really part of his playbook as well to say, well, the option to me is the nuclear one, but I'm not going to use that, and that's me showing strength. But the sanctions imposed today is really the last form of sanction left for America to impose in it, or is there another economic lever that's not apparently clear?
So I'm not an economics or a sanctions expert, so I don't want to go too deep into that. What I will say is there's been some very confused signalling and messaging over the last couple of weeks, and there's a really interesting, if you study these sorts of things, really interesting dance that's going back and forth between America and Iran. So, initially where the reports were just that it's a drone, the White House came out very quickly and said, no, there's cruise missiles and Iran's behind it. And I saw some analysts that I know and trust, verifying that very quickly. But then they kind of walked that back very quickly as well within, sort of 24 hours. Now he's using stronger language again, which might be his New York real estate way of kind of upping the ante without having to do anything serious. But there's some very interesting messaging back and forth as to, who is the stronger side, who has what leverage.
Sitting on the Resolute desk in the Oval Office is a sculpture that's been made by an artist from Mudgee. It's a beautiful touch. It's the gift between the Prime Minister and the President, and it's the recognition of, when I was talking about before a specific example of an American and an Australian working together to save each other's lives. What is represented by this sculpture?
So again, I think, looking at the nature of the relationship between the two, you don't just sign a treaty as we did in the early 1950s and then suddenly become fast allies. Often it's driven by practical or pragmatic purposes. Where it becomes special and valuable is cumulatively over time. And when I speak to US officials, again, from the highest level, those who have been in the White House previously as advisors and such, the one way they describe the relationship is always reliable. I've done a lot of war games and other things with American officials, and the way that they treat allies, even subconsciously, is different. And I think that's pretty intuitive. If you've got a friend or a family member who you have to help out all the time, it's a little different how you respond to them if they are always needy and always asking for support versus those who are genuinely independent and self-sufficient and you see as a peer and once in a while ask you. And I think that's where the Australian relationship falls into. As one example, one official or former official I won't name, said whenever we called, they always picked up the phone. And it didn't matter if it was, 4 clearance divers, around a petroleum, offshore petroleum base, off Iran, or if it's, sending troops to Iran or to Iraq or to Syria. And then there's also the nature of the support. Some of the most valuable military support Australia has given has actually been in the headquarters. It's been the planning. There's,
strategic.
Strategic, operational, tactical, but again, it's reliability. It's people they can trust and people that they can, feel have the responsibility to take on work and efforts that others don't. They, for instance, in the Middle East, there is a time where Australian commanders were commanding US troops or US aircraft that only Australia, Britain and the US were allowed to do because they trust our guys to do it properly.
Well, Jude Mollen, an example of that, of course.
Right.
Very well said. Very well said, John Watts. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And